To be afraid is the most human of all emotions. When fear seems to surround us, our imagination supplies it with a face. Every one of us has struggled with secret, nameless fears, never quite knowing where reality ends and the imagination takes over. From these struggles, strange creatures are born. Monsters arise from the deepest layers of the human mind. When people hunted werewolves, when they searched for monsters in far-off places, or tried desperately to ward off vampires, they were engaged in a universal human activity. They were looking for the source of primal fear. Monster hunting has a history almost as long as humanity itself. It is a strange and unsuspected one. To follow the story of monsters is to follow one of the deepest and darkest undercurrents of human history. Monsters are images of the primal fears which surround every life. But once upon a time there seem to have been images which calmed and contained those fears. It is remarkable that the only art in the history of the world which has no monsters is that of our Stone Age ancestors. Apart from the wild animals on which they depended, the most common images are mysterious carvings of a mother goddess, which seem to embody the primal force of fertility and life. These sacred images appear to have soothed the primal terrors of death, which give rise to monsters.
I think that when an image is sacred, and especially when it's a goddess or a god, it seems to carry the power of life and death within it, so that awe is the appropriate response to it, not just fear and not just hope, but something that unites the two.
Perhaps their devotion to a mother goddess made early humanity feel that death was part of an endless cycle of fertility and rebirth, that it held no terrors for them.
The mother goddess whose womb gave birth to all life also took all life back into her womb. So there was a place for the imagination to rest, as it were, in its thoughts about death.
The massive cultural upheavals brought about by the rise of the high civilizations would mean the disappearance of the mother goddess. 5,000 years ago in the Middle East, priests and kings established a very different concept of the sources of life and death. The worship of solar gods took over, and the mother goddess was lost. Monstrous images sprang up everywhere in myth and art. It was as if a container for humanity's fears had been lost, and they were unleashed upon the human imagination in the form of monsters. When Babylonian priests imagined the creation of their world, they imagined not the calm mysteries of fertility, but a violent struggle with a primeval monster of chaos, a serpent, Tiamat.
Tiamat, in origin, was the mother goddess. She gave birth to everything and was therefore a divine image, numinous. But by the time the Babylonians are looking at her, they don't see her as divine because they don't value creation in that way. So they see her as monstrous, as chaotic, as the floods which might overtake them every spring, which they have to fight and bring order to. And so they see the fight against Tiamat as one of light against darkness.
The great Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, tells how the solar god Marduk waged a ferocious battle against the Tiamat. Marduk was the first of a very long line of culture heroes throughout history who would fight and destroy monsters. Finally, with his mace, Marduk crushed the Tiamat's skull. He split her dead body like a shellfish into two parts. From half of her he made the sky, and from the other half he made the earth and waters. As well as in the Middle East, the first high civilizations of Asia and the Americas would all imagine the world arising not naturally from the womb of a mother goddess, but from the violently dismembered body of a female monster. This triumph over the monster would become identified with the triumphs of order over chaos, spirit over matter, and good over evil. The snake biting its own tail had once been an image of eternity. To the ancient Hebrews, snakes became identified with evil monsters.
There is a particular image called the Cup of Lagash, which is very old, 2800 BC, where two dragons draw back, as it were, an entrance which reveals a god called Ningid-Zida, who is imaged as two serpents embracing. Obviously, death and life were shown us here. We have it in the image of the two snakes, male and female. But this same serpent, when it turns up in the myth of Genesis, it is only a serpent of death. And of course, it is the serpent that brings death to humankind. So we have here a very telling example of a beauteous image that has become a monster.
And it was in Eden that the first vampire was created, Lilith.
Before Adam had the wife named Eve, he had another wife before her, who was named Lilith. And Lilith disobeyed Adam, and so God punished her. He had his angels drive her and her children from paradise and had them killed, the children. So Lilith wants revenge. What's revenge? Revenge against the children of Adam and Eve.
The ancient Hebrews believed that Lilith, winged and with a serpent's tail, came in the night to suck the lifeblood from her unsuspecting victims. During this period in ancient Greece, myths of heroes began to spread. Like Marduk, they battled female monsters of darkness. To the ancient Greeks, the story of Perseus was full of the hidden meanings of these battles with monsters. Perseus, the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, was living at the court of King Polydectes. The king hated Perseus and wanted to get rid of him. Knowing he was a proud young man who would never turn down a challenge, the king said to him that he should go and bring back the head of Medusa, one of the gorgons. The gorgons were the most terrifying of all monsters. Women with tusks and a head full of snakes. One look from their horrifying faces was enough to turn a man to stone. Many had gone to conquer them. None had returned.
We usually know her as a monster from Perseus's point of view. But in fact, as her name suggests, she was originally the queen, the mistress. And so she represented the fertility of the earth and the underworld. And as we can see in her story, she lives at the limit of day, just as the sun would go into darkness. In other words, in the magical land of the unknown, where we can't go with our rational minds.
Perseus accepted the challenge, which would surely have led to his death if the gods had not smiled upon him. Armed with a shield of burnished gold that Athene, goddess of wisdom, gave him, Perseus set out for the twilight world of the Gorgons. He knew that above all else he must never look the Gorgon in the face.
And when Perseus slays the monster, looking at it from his point of view, what is freed is Pegasus, the winged horse, who is an image of the imagination. And also the blood from the veins in the neck of the Medusa eventually comes to go to the god of healing, Asclepius. Blood from the left vein he slays, and blood from the right vein he heals. So we're almost back to the image of the goddess who holds the serpents of life and death in her hands, through whom their opposition is reconciled. The story of Perseus slaying the Gorgon is a typical hero myth, in that Perseus separates from his society and from his conscious, rational mind, and has to journey to the edge of day, where he is initiated into his own deeper levels of being through the slaying of his fear. In this case, the fear is imaged as the monster, which is the Gorgon.
Perseus used Athene's shield as a mirror in which to see the Gorgon's image without looking at her directly. This symbolized the wisdom of first reflecting on one's terror rather than confronting it face to face. It was this wisdom that allowed Perseus to finally bring back the powers of imagination and healing contained in the Gorgon's monstrous form. No monster has been so often destroyed by heroes as the dragon, the most universal of all monsters. The dragon is a serpent with legs and wings who breathes fire. It has meant very different things to different people. In ancient China, dragons were revered as a creative force in nature. They were a wholly positive symbol of the energy of life. In the Western tradition, they became, like Tiamat, the threatening force of chaos and darkness which had to be defeated. St. George was a Christian soldier in the Roman army, somewhere in the Middle East. There he came across a town which every year had to offer young maidens to a terrible dragon. Like a true hero, St. George set out to slay the dragon and release the people from their bondage. To medieval Europe, engaged in a constant battle with Islam, the legend of St. George and the Dragon became an allegory of the triumph of Christianity over paganism. It became an emblem of the Crusades. It stood for Europe's hopes of success in its holy war to reclaim Jerusalem for the Christian world. The image of Christian virtue harnessing the dying dragon of the Muslim world was reproduced throughout Europe. It reassured peasants of the superiority of their faith and gave heart to knights on their way to Palestine. It reminded everybody that only Christ could save the damned and the pagan from the dragons of hell. As Europeans began to explore the world in the Middle Ages, they searched for the monsters they had read about in myth. Whereas the Greeks considered the hero's odyssey to the edge of the world to be symbolic, the Venetian explorers of the 15th century were determined to enact it in reality. As they headed for the unknown, their maps made it clear what they would find.
In the Middle Ages, life was ordered vertically along a great chain or ladder of creation, where heaven is at the top and the earth is at the bottom, the plants go out of it, and somewhere in between come men, and below them apes, and there's a space in between those, potentially fillable with monstrosities. So in one sense, these monstrous races were located on the edge of the map of mankind, in those kind of dark recesses, those nether links of the chain of being between man and animal creation. In another sense, they had a geographical location beyond the reach of exploration as it had penetrated at that time.
When Christopher Columbus prepared to sail west in 1492, he calculated that the first land he sighted would be the island Marco Polo had called Cipangu, Japan. Neither he nor the King and Queen of Spain who commissioned his travels had any reason to imagine the continent which would block his path.
He was hoping to find great civilizations, rich societies, which his backers could exploit by way of trade. Columbus was expecting that on his way to these great civilizations, he might find monstrous races of hominoid creatures.
America was a bitter disappointment. There were no great civilizations and no riches in evidence. He tried desperately to avoid disappointing his royal backers. Funding for future journeys would depend on it. In his reports, he apologized for not having personally seen the monsters which populated the Indies. However, he said, many of his men had. Columbus was also gravely disillusioned by the people he called Indians. They seemed neither civilized nor Asiatic. He tried to reassure the king that they could be productively put to work to create the rich colonies the Spanish crown desired. As colonization progressed, these same Indians would provide the source of monsters for which the European public was so eager. Later explorers would soberly report tribes of dog-headed men, tribes with tails who lived in trees, and most famously of all, tribes of headless men. After 3 grueling voyages to the Caribbean, Columbus was racked by exhaustion, persistent illness, and a crushing sense of failure. His enterprise was in ruins. He found refuge in an obsessive Christian piety. He searched and found in the Bible prophecies of his discoveries and became convinced they heralded the end of the world. He now said his voyages were crusades aimed at finding a westerly route to Jerusalem. As his death approached, he frequently dressed as a Franciscan monk, his mind filled with hopes for the coming reign of Christ. The fantastic discoveries in America coincided with a change in the European imagination of monsters. Warfare had become endemic in Europe. Church and state were balanced precariously on a sea of unrest. The powers that be struggled desperately to secure themselves against impending chaos. From this fear, new monsters grew, not the wondrous creatures of distant primitive lands, but terrifying monsters at the heart of civilization itself. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a strange hysteria began to spread through the remote mountainous regions of Western Europe. In these usually placid backwaters of the continent, people became convinced that there were monsters about who could change from humans into animals at will. Werewolves were on the loose. Gilles Garnier was an eccentric recluse living in the Jura region of France. In 1571, a number of children disappeared in the area. Finally, in 1573, a wolf with the features of Garnier was said to have been seen attacking a little girl. Terrified, the local people organized a hunt. The legends about people becoming wolves go far back in time. They said that people bitten by a wolf would themselves become one at full moon. As their bodies changed, they would also be overtaken by the ferocious bloodlust and cunning of the wolf. The wolf was one of the few natural predators in Europe, and like man, it hunted in packs. To the early Europeans, it was the perfect symbol of the bestial savagery of which man was capable. In the 16th century, Europeans became convinced that people could really change into wolves. Garnier was one of hundreds who were hunted as werewolves. But the hunt was not limited to werewolves. At exactly the same times and places that werewolves like Garnier were being pursued, the great witch hunt was gathering momentum. Witches and werewolves were often executed together. The possibility that humans could take on the nature of wild animals had not always been greeted with terror. At initiation rites on Mount Lycaeus in ancient Greece, young warriors were stripped naked, dressed in wolf skins, fed raw meat, and sent into the forest to live like wild beasts. The idea behind these initiation rites was that society could put animal nature to good use in warfare and the hunt. For men to take on the savage nature of wolves was seen as a positive thing. In other societies too, the idea of men sharing their natures with animals was seen not as monstrous, but as necessary and good. On the northwest coast of America, the ceremonies of the Kwakiutl Indians dramatized this boundary crossing between the human and animal. This was seen as part of an exchange with nature on which their lives depended. The creator spirits they revered were all half human, half animal beings. Ancient wolfmen were the European versions of this spiritual exchange with nature. But by the 16th century, all forms of man-animal boundary crossings had been demonized. Under torture, Gilles Garnier confessed to having the power to become a wolf at will. He said he had eaten scores of small children. In December 1573, he was burnt alive at the stake. As European exploration of the world progressed, a host of new discoveries challenged old views about the nature of humans and animals. The encounter with the large apes of Africa and Asia unleashed a storm of controversy.
In the Middle Ages, apes had generally been seen as a degenerate species of man, as a kind of human-like creature that had forfeited its humanity by rejecting civilized disciplines and by sort of self-abandonment to sinfulness. Gradually, that conception was reversed by increasing acquaintance with apes as they really were. And no species of ape was more important than the orangutan. The orangutan almost looked like the kind of enfleshment of this long-imagined being. And indeed, there was a long debate about where the orangutan fitted into the chain of being, whether he belonged with man or whether he belonged with animal creation. And right up to the late 18th century, there were plenty of theorists actively defending the humanity of the orangutan. This tradition of the human orangutan was finally satirized to death by the early 19th century novelist Thomas Love Peacock, one of whose heroes was an orangutan who had every rational faculty except the use of speech, and therefore developed a reputation as a profound but cautious thinker, was elected to Parliament and became a baronet.
In the 18th century, the scientific investigation of monsters gathered momentum. In 1725, Johann Flückiger was to stimulate a fierce debate about the nature of monsters. He was in Serbia, serving as a doctor in the Austrian army. A series of strange deaths in the area where he was stationed had created a panic in the local population. He began to question the villagers. They all had the same story. It was a bizarre sickness they had never seen before. They told him that before the victims died, they all claimed that a local peasant, Arno Pauli, had come to them in the night. Arno Pauli had died 2 months before the first victim fell ill. The villagers were terrified. They finally went to his grave to find out for themselves the truth of the matter. The body was just as it had been the day he was buried. There was fresh blood on it. Flückinger's careful chronicle of the case created a sensation. Now science had documented and publicized a monster that the educated classes had never taken seriously before. The idea of people who could return from the grave was irresistible. What if death was not the end? The undead were about to take the European imagination by storm.
The one fear that most humans have is of dying. If you really love life, and most of us do, you would like to live forever. Here is someone who promises you physical immortality. The trouble is the price you have to pay for that physical immortality. That is, you must become a parasite.
Legends of blood-sucking monsters of the night stretch back to Lilith and beyond. The idea that some people may not die completely and come back to haunt the living is also almost universal. European peasant vampires of the type Flückinger chronicled were not handsome aristocratic strangers, but the known recent dead, relatives who returned to take their kin with them. Suicides, sinners, or just chance victims of bad magic could all become such vampires. There was a variety of ways of dealing with them. Because vampires had become demonic, it was thought that a cross or any religious symbol would keep them at bay. Garlic, a good all-purpose peasant medicine, was also thought to be effective.
One of the ways is you take poppy seeds and you strew them on the road or the way between the churchyard and the village. And the vampire, who is a compulsive counter, he loves that, has to stop and pick up each one of the poppy seeds. And if you're lucky, it'll take him all night to pick those up. And when the sun comes up, he's got to go back and rest in his coffin. Now, sunlight does not kill a vampire the way you see it in some of the movies, but it is a time when he's not quite as powerful. Another way to deter a vampire is driving the wooden stake through the heart. You pin it to the earth, and then if you're worried still that some idiot's going to come along someday and pull out the stake, you burn the body.
One of the most enthusiastic students of this folklore was the Irishman, Bram Stoker.
He invented virtually nothing. That's the irony of Bram Stoker's novel. People read it and think, oh, this comes from his wild imagination. Didn't. It came from Transylvanian folklore and from Irish folklore that he heard from his mother, who was from County Sligo in the west of Ireland, where they had a huge cholera epidemic. And this Dracula vampire phenomenon is very close to a plague.
Like a plague, vampirism was contagious. In fact, epidemics were often blamed on the undead.
And he called his novel The Undead. Till Galleys, it was called The Undead. And then just by, I think, a stroke of luck, he decided to give it that name. He wrote it 3 times in the manuscript. Dracula, Dracula, Dracula. Most people are fascinated by Dracula because it's this notion of someone who knows exactly what he wants and has no conscience pangs whatsoever about getting it. He's somewhat like a predator, and that appeals to some people. He's definite, he's aggressive, he's commanding, and he wants to live forever.
One of the inspirations for Stoker's Dracula was a real historical figure, Vlad Tepes, the Impaler. Tepes had been a sadistic Transylvanian warlord in the 15th century. One of his nicknames had been Dracula.
And what Stoker was fascinated with was this notion that he liked to dine amid his impaled victims. Impalement is the way he liked to kill people. Impalement is a lost art. You stick people up on stakes like popsicles. Then he would gather the blood in bowls in front of his table, and he'd take bread, dip it in the blood, and slurp it down. It was sort of this idea that, you know, you can acquire the characteristics of someone you've killed by ingesting their blood, because it was thought that the blood carried the principle of life of the other person, the soul itself.
Vlad Dracula supplied Stoker with the idea of a cruel aristocrat and a place, Transylvania. The idea of Dracula's insatiable thirst for blood came from another source, a 17th century Hungarian noblewoman known as the Blood Countess. Her real name was Elizabeth Bathory, and she came from one of the most powerful and famous families of Hungary. When her wealthy husband died, she retired to her castle at Chaita in what is now Slovakia. There she began to dabble in Satanism. Elizabeth Bathory had become famous for her beauty and her attempts to keep it. At Chaita, she surrounded herself with a group of women who shared her passion for the occult. Together, they developed an insane obsession with discovering the secret of an unchanging and eternal life. The blood of young virgins was the key, they decided. Countess Bathory's first victims were her serving maids. After that, her staff were sent out to scour the countryside for young girls and bring them by whatever means to her torture chambers at Chaita. When Hungarian officers finally broke into her castle, they found the remains of over 60 young girls in the cellars, their bodies drained of blood. Parts of the bodies had been eaten. Since she was cousin to the king, she avoided execution. Instead, she was walled up inside her castle where she died, alone and insane, 4 years later. What intrigued Bram Stoker about her story was the hunger for blood and the sacrilegious obsession with eternal life.
Odd as it may seem, you can go straight back to the Paleolithic goddess of Lucelle, who was covered in red ochre as an image of blood, because this was felt to be therefore life-giving. Now, it's almost as if we have the literalization of a symbol in the Dracula myth. What was resonant as a symbol becomes degraded and abhorrent when it's taken literally and when it's acted out literally. Because in the definition of the monster, we only have death, and so we only have the deathly aspect of blood, which is still taken in as though it were to give life. And yet the awe and the sacredness of blood is, of course, completely defiled.
Dracula marked the decline of the European belief that monsters really existed. This did not mean that people stopped thinking about monsters, just that now they did it in fiction. Science had destroyed the belief in monsters, but in the imagination it created many more of its own. Dr. Frankenstein's monster was put together from dead bodies, a composite corpse which the brilliant scientist discovered how to infuse with life. The result of this arrogant meddling with the mysteries of nature was not a wondrous creation, but a tragic monster. Science was the perfect arena in which to fictionally experiment with monstrous distortions of nature. And there was no nature so puzzling and fearful to the 19th century as human nature. Finally, there was the dim recognition that the root of the monstrous was man himself. In literature, one of the greatest scientists of human nature was Robert Louis Stevenson. His story of how a monster was bred from the tortured inner conflicts of his age is one of the finest ever written. Jekyll was a brilliant and ambitious young doctor in bourgeois Victorian society. Being excessively high-minded, he was obsessed with the conflict between his moral nature and his baser instincts. What if these two warring parts of the soul could be separated into two quite distinct identities? All his research was directed to this theme. One day, his lawyer was stunned to discover that Dr. Jekyll had made a will in which he left everything to a certain Edward Hyde. Hyde was a brutal, misshapen character with no conscience. He filled everybody who came across him with loathing and terror. What possible connection could he have with Jekyll? Hyde had not a trace of morality. All his desires were venal and sadistic, and he satisfied them without compunction. He led a depraved life in the flesh pots of London's East End. The truth, of course, was that Dr. Jekyll had discovered the secret of separating the warring natures of man into two identities. He had discovered an unknown drug and experimented on himself. He and Edward Hyde were one. Hyde was the face of the Victorian gentleman's forbidden and brutal desires. Jekyll's scientific triumph quickly turned to nightmare. The vital ingredient for the drug that allowed him to control his transformations ran out. Hyde, once unleashed, could not be contained and only grew in strength. Jekyll, meanwhile, far from being liberated from his darker nature, fell to pieces. He realized that his high-mindedness meant nothing without Hyde's animal energies. The only way to stop the monstrous Hyde was to kill himself. Hyde marked the end of a long history in which the monstrous had migrated into the inner recesses of the human mind. He was a reminder that monsters are created only when some part of our inner life is rejected and denied. Perhaps this is the final truth about monsters. They are the image of something vital and life-giving which has been lost. That is why to many ancient cultures, monsters were not only images of terror, they also pointed to something much greater.
Well, the original meaning of the word monster comes from the Latin word monere, which means to warn, and it was a divine warning or portent, something marvelous that shone through nature to alert us to the presence of the divine.
There is a reason why monsters have beset the human imagination for so long. They may be images of terror, terror of our own savagery or death, but they are also images of awe, the awe we experience in the face of the inexplicable. Humanity needs its monsters. As Dr. Jekyll discovered, if we try to escape from them, they become more terrifying. The confrontation with monsters is something that just can't be avoided. The history of monsters is the history of humanity's struggle to see its own hidden face.